All right, so this is our final learning for this area of study, and it's basically like a bringing it all together and looking at how we can use these sorts of technologies in real life. So we're going to look at a little bit deeper into what genetically modified organisms are, and we're going to look at a couple of examples of how we can use it, especially in plants. So we talked about this at the very start of this chapter, but I just want to reiterate with a little bit more detail. So we talked about genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, being any organism in which their genetic information has been manipulated in any way. And this could be through any of the technologies that we've learnt about along the way. Again, it's usually for the addition of desirable traits, but can also be used to silence or remove undesirable traits as well. So any host organism that has this altered genetic makeup using our engineering technologies is a GMO. So that's how we categorize or define that. Then we can go a little bit deeper and look at the two main types of GMO. Okay, so these are both types of GMO. They're just two different types of GMO. So you can have a cisgenic organism or a cisgenic GMO. So that basically means an organism that has been genetically modified but has genes from the same species inserted into its genome via cisgenesis. So that's like a sunflower has a gene that we really like, and then it's given to another sunflower to improve it. Okay, so that's what cisgenesis is. So species between the same species genetically modifying. Then we have transgenic organisms. So this is when we genetically modify an organism that has genes from a different species. So a different species gene is inserted via transgenesis. So this is if we have that same desirable trait in that sunflower, but then we've put it into a corn plant, for instance. Okay, so that would be a transgenic organism. So both of those are types of GMOs. It's just a little bit different of where we're getting the genes from for them. So how do we make GMOs? So we've sort of been learning this along the way. So transgenic plants specifically have been produced to increase productivity, increase disease resistance. There's so many different ways that we can change a species to make it into a genetically modified organism and improve its productivity or whatever. So we've been through this, okay? We know how we can make GMOs. There's lots of different ways. So we need to identify a gene of interest. So that's always going to be the first step. And then we might amplify this using PCR or something like that. So for example, let's say that we want to improve drought tolerance in a plant. Then we can deliver the gene. So we can do this through a range of ways. We can do this through CRISPR, which we learned about. We can do this via bacterial plasmid, which we've learnt about. And then the transformed cells, so whatever that looks like, is then grown repeatedly and cultured under sterile conditions. And then finally, once we have the organism that we want, we then put it in the field for agricultural use. So here's a little a depiction down here, but it's really everything that we've learnt about coming together. So we isolate that gene, we use restriction enzymes, ligases, etc. We might amplify it using PCR. We might use CRISPR or recombinant DNA cloning to introduce the gene of interest. And then we have our final product of the GMO at the end. Okay, so here's a few examples. So for instance, using CRISPR in plants. So let's say that we have we want to modify a gene in the roots, for instance, which might help with seed production or something like that. We can use CRISPR to edit the DNA inside that flower and modify the seeds so that we can have enhanced seedling generation in the next generation. So that's how we can use something like CRISPR. We could also use something like DNA cloning for the same sort of thing. So let's say we wanted to introduce resistance to pesticides. So we could find a gene that is resistant to pesticides, maybe in another animal. We can make a recombinant plasmid for that, transform it into a bacteria, and then insert that into the new plant and then grow them to have a resistant plant to pesticides. So all of these things that we've been learning about, they're not just concepts. These are things that are actually happening and that we're doing to improve things like agriculture. Of course, there's a couple of ethical considerations we need to think about when we're talking about GMOs. So there's a lot of people, might be uncomfortable with the fact that many of the plants and foods that they eat aren't natural or they've been modified in some way. So we need to think of the pros and cons before we do things like this. So we've got our biological ethical considerations. So there might be really awesome benefits, like we might be able to use fewer pesticides if we can make sure that our plants are resistant to insects by themselves, and that makes our food safer to eat. However, we could also reduce crop diversity. So if we are making one plant that is basically a clone in all of our crops, then we are severely reducing genetic diversity in that crop. So if something comes around and it might wipe out the entire crop. So that diversity is really important. We'd be losing that if we genetically modify our organisms. One social benefit is that we can produce more food. So if we can increase the yield of crop that is being produced every year, and we can have more corn and more of all those foods, we have better food security. But then on the other hand, of course, we do have a con that we'd have to buy new seeds every season. So for instance, they might add a new drought tolerance, or they might add this and this and this, which might be very costly to farmers to keep up with all of the genetically modified things that are happening. We then just have some general ones. People just, they believe the benefits outweigh the cons. So even if they are worried about the safety or whatever, they still think that if we can produce food, enough food for everybody, then that outweighs the cons. But then other people might see that as we are altering our natural food sources. They might say there's nothing wrong with our food sources and that GMOs are unnatural and that we shouldn't be playing with the natural state of the world. So we still need to think about these ethical considerations. Even though GMOs are already happening, they're already a thing that's been happening for many years, we still need to think about that when we're making new GMOs. So thank you for watching. Hopefully that helped. Please bring any questions to class and I'll see you there.